Nationwide protests sparked by land rights issues, underpinned by long-simmering tension between the country's largest ethnic groups and the minority groups that comprise the government and ruling classes, which have been cracking down on media coverage under the cover of the nation's anti-terrorist law. And while many in D.C.'s local diaspora have been following the unrest in Ethiopia, a gesture of protest at the Rio Olympic marathon finish line has brought the issue to an international stage. Here with us to discuss the unrest in the country and how censorship there affects perspectives in communities around the world, including those in Washington, is Soliyana Shimeles. She's a founding member of Zone 9 bloggers, which started in Ethiopia. She currently works for Ethiopia Human Rights Project. Soli, good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
When we first met you in our hotel in Addis in early 2014, when we sat down with you and two of your fellow Zone 9 bloggers, you were taking a serious risk in talking to us. That conversation and others tracing the story of Zone 9 bloggers' subsequent arrest and eventual release are available on our website, kojoshow.org/Ethiopia. But to catch people up, what was the goal of that group, and what kind of restrictions for independent media in Ethiopia were you facing?
The goal of Zone 9 was to discuss between young people on the concerning issues of Ethiopia. So we have this motto of we blog because we care, and we had been blogging online and doing social media campaigns for 2 years before the arrest. So it is pretty much a result of the closing of the offline media environment in Ethiopia. We found the internet a better place to discuss and to channel our opinions. So that was the objective of the 9 bloggers. And after the arrest and the immediate release, back home, our couple of colleagues are still there, and some of us are out here.
Your colleagues were released, but they remain under threat of detention again?
That's true. Our case is still going on at Supreme Court, including myself. So there's always a threat of going back to jail.
When it comes to the ongoing Oromo protests and the crackdown on them, in addition to protests in Amharic areas as well, how do you put that issue, that set of really complex issues, in context for people who are not familiar with the political and cultural landscape in Ethiopia?
So what happened is, if we can see the protest in Oromia region, it started before 9 months. And the reason was a very simple reason, that people surrounding the Addis Ababa area, which is Oromia region, asked that the expansion of Addis Ababa will affect their life, their social fabric, and also their economic interests. Therefore, the expansion of Addis Ababa plan, which is called a master plan, should be halted, or it should be integrated with their region, in which that incorporates their interests. And then the protest started that way, and it spread all over the Oromia region, which is the largest region in Ethiopia. And that went for the last 9 months. It was on and off, and more than 400 people had been killed. And recently, these protests expanded to the Amhara region for other reason, which is also a question of identity and administration. But at the same time, the second largest ethnic group, which is Amhara, is also now protesting in Ethiopia. So in general, for the last 1 year, the 2 largest ethnic groups and the 2 largest regions in the country are protesting.
And the perception is that the government of Ethiopia is dominated by people from the Tigray.
That's true. The government of the Ethiopia, which is EPRDF, the ruling party, is dominated by the Tigrayan People Liberation Front, which represents a 6% minority population from the north.
800-433-8850 if you have questions or comments, and given the number of Ethiopians in this region, we expect we will have questions or comments. 800-433-8850. You can send email to kojo@wamu.org. If you're part of the Ethiopian diaspora, tell us what you think about what's happening there and about the gesture that was made at the Olympics. You can also send us a tweet at Kojo Show, or go to our website, kojoshow.org, ask a question or make a comment there. Joining us now by phone from Minnesota is Fred Desam Lazaro. Fred Desam Lazaro, who's a correspondent for the PBS NewsHour and executive director of the Undertold Stories Project. Fred, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Kojo.
Fred, overlaid on top of the protests, Ethiopia has been battling a drought this year. You never quite know what you'll get into on a reporting trip overseas, but what did you go into your trip to Ethiopia expecting to cover?
We expected fully to cover the drought story and expected very little hindrance. I've been to Ethiopia before and, in fact, covered issues that are far more sensitive than the drought, which overall is an interesting story, not entirely negative, in the sense that even though the drought that Ethiopia has faced over the past couple of years has been enormous, it's been epic in terms of how dry it's been. It's been a 50-year drought. It's much worse than the one that triggered the famine in the 1980s that became such an icon for all the images that it brought to the world. But on this occasion, there has been some preparation. There's a lot better governance than there was before in the manner of building infrastructure to get food distribution in place, those sorts of things. And the narrative is far more positive generally, with the general theme being that famine, that drought does not necessarily need to lead to famine. That is the gist of the overall story, with warts in it.
So that was the story you were going to cover.
Exactly.
And any foreign journalists working in Ethiopia have had to file quite a lot of paperwork. Mm-hmm. We experienced some of that. At what point in your interaction with officials there did you start to suspect that this might not go the way you anticipated?
Completely blindsided, Kojo, because we had meticulous paperwork stamped and signed by all the appropriate officials, including at the ministerial level. I mean, this was signed off on, and so we thought we would, we had the biggest foot propelling us forward. But it turns out that we were stopped very, very early into a location shoot, told to report to security, and the enormous amount of impunity with which these folks acted just really blindsided me. I was not expecting that it would hijack the whole story. But that is, in fact, what it did.
It hijacked the whole story because you were in the Oromo region and
right.
you were
Pre-approved.
You were detained for how long?
Well, depending on the definition of detention, we were told to report to security after visiting a small farm on the way to Shashamane, which is a town in Oromia, and there we sat for a couple or 3 hours, expecting things to be ironed out. But at the end of that meeting, we were told to surrender our passports, cell phones, and any electronic gear, and pick them up in Addis the next day if we could get there by then. That's what we did. So it was about 26 hours before we got that our equipment back, and instructions essentially not to go anywhere but within the core city of Addis.
And, when one asks, well, what reasons were you given? When we were in Ethiopia and asked officials about the restrictions on press, we were told time and again that the anti-terror laws used to arrest many journalists were necessary because of the quote-unquote dangerous neighborhood that the country of Ethiopia happens to be in. Was that essentially the same refrain that you and your colleagues were given?
Actually, we were given zero explanation until the very end when our gear was given back to us. We were squeaky clean, as we started out being. Even if we wanted to do mischief, there had not been any time mischief in their eyes. We had literally no time. This was the afternoon after we'd arrived, late the previous night. I mean, we didn't literally have any time to do anything that would be untoward. But no, it was no explanation whatsoever when we started to question it. And I remember telling the official, I said, or the police, the security fellow, I said, it's illegal to confiscate someone's passport without a receipt. I would like to call my embassy. We were told that we could spend the night in jail if we preferred. I mean, that was as much explanation as we got until we were given our stuff back, and they said, well, it's a security reason. You didn't get clearance from security, is what we were told at the end of the day.
Soli, we can use your informed speculation at this point. Do you think that happened simply because they happen to be journalists who were in the Oromo region?
I think there's a hyper-paranoia, if I can call it that, about any kind of imagery leaving the country. And and that's what I gleaned from the interviews that each of us, the interrogations that each of us had to undergo. They kept looking for images. They kept looking for hidden cameras. Did we have any more cameras than the 3 that we declared? And they were on a hunt for any kind of linkages that we might have with people that they didn't want us to have linkages with.
Back to you, Soliyana. While the Oromo protests have certainly been at the front of a lot of Ethiopians' minds, both in country and in the diaspora, the challenges of getting reliable information out of the country means others may have been less aware. But that changed last week when Fayisa Lelisa made a very public gesture of protest. At the finish line of the Olympic marathon, in which he took a silver medal, we should mention that he is Oromo himself. What are you hearing about the reaction to his action, and what did the gesture of crossing his arms like that signify?
That was one of the surprising reactions from any athlete who represents Ethiopia at the Olympics level. I mean, people used to say that, like, if we have one of such athletes who can show some gestures about what's going on in country, it would be very nice. And I mean, it was
and one, of course, remembers the 1968 gestures of black athletes from the U.S., from the United States, who raised their fists, and the controversy it caused in this country, Tommy Smith and John Carlos.
But I guess in Ethiopia, so many people took him as a hero, including myself, and people were really surprised because that's a very, very risky act to do, not only for his career, but also for his life, for people's life back home, who are his families and colleagues, and also for many more who might be related with this. But people were really excited, and people were like, most people couldn't believe that he actually did that, because it really means a lot for not only for the Oromo ethnic groups, but also for every Ethiopian who had been following this.
And that's a gesture that's familiar to people.
It is very familiar. People use that gesture in protests in country, in Oromia region, and also in current Amhara region. It's almost a gesture of resistance and protesters. Peaceful protesters go out and use that gesture of crossing their arms.
As someone who left Ethiopia under threat of arrest yourself, what was your immediate reaction to that protest, and what do you think he's experiencing right now?
I was shocked first. I was freezing. I was so happy, but at the same time, I was like, this is a very, very risky move, and he's really courageous to do so. I'm sure he was feeling confused after that, because howsoever you're ready to do such courageous acts when it happens, because it's going to affect you personally at that point. So I'm sure he had been thinking a lot of things, how he's going to settle in the future, how the safety of his families, because we all had been experiencing that. We all thought that, like, what am I going to do with my life, and what's going to happen to my families back home? So I'm sure he had been having all these thoughts in his mind. Yeah.
Fred, you're based in another part of the country, Minnesota, where there's a large Ethiopian diaspora, and you've covered the country before. Did that gesture resound as much in that area as it has in this?
Quite honestly, Kojo, I just returned today from a reporting trip, so I couldn't tell you. But I would bet you any money that it did, and it is. I just haven't personally been able to go out there. There's no question in my mind that it ricocheted all over the Ethiopian community here.
Well, back to your experience, because your career has been built on telling undertold stories. How surprised were you by the experience you had in Ethiopia last week, and how does it compare to other challenges you faced on the ground?
I was surprised. I'm fairly experienced at working in difficult situations for journalists, but I must say that in Ethiopia, I was completely surprised at the intensity with which the security folks go after journalists, including foreign journalists, on a relatively innocuous assignment, approved at ministerial levels. There is a lot going on in Ethiopia that warrants our attention with regard to just development in general, social entrepreneurship, water projects, even refugee issues. If you go out into the Doloado area, for example, so it's a country, and it's a country rich with stories. There is a lot of farmland being leased long term to overseas investors, for example. That's another interesting story. So it's a journalist paradise, or it should be, and it's a fascinating country, but it's uniquely repressive when it comes to journalists, I think, in my experience, in 63 countries so far. And, and very disappointing at the end of the day.
Here's Andrea in Washington, D.C. Andrea, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my name is Andrea Barron, and I work with the Torture, Abolition, and Survivors Support Coalition, Task International. We work with over 300 torture survivors here in Washington, D.C., and about two-thirds of them are from Ethiopia. They've been tortured by the ruling regime, and the gesture by Lalisa resonated tremendously with our survivors. And I want to just tell you very quickly we also have several long-distance runners. One of our long-distance runners was training himself for the Olympics, and he participated in a peaceful demonstration in December of 2015. He was wearing training clothes, and the ruling regime knew that he was a famous athlete, and they tortured him in his feet because they knew that he was a runner, and they wanted to punish him by torturing him directly in his feet. And then he was terrified about going to a hospital. He did not go to a hospital because he was afraid in the government hospital he would not be treated. He finally came to the United States in February of 2016, and he's now getting treated by a local podiatrist. And he's just one of many, many survivors. So I just want to say finally that we hope that the United States will react to what's going on in Ethiopia. The U.S. provides over $600 million a year to Ethiopia, so they have the leverage to try to force the Ethiopian government to stop torturing and killing its people.
Well, thank you very much for your call. Fred, one of the things that was made clear to us when we were visiting with the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia is that this is a very delicate matter because the U.S. is relying on Ethiopia to deal with the threat of terrorism coming from places like Somalia, but it would appear that there's a sentiment here that the U.S. is simply just not doing enough.
Hard for me to judge that directly, but you hear that a lot.
Yep.
They are very, very interested in episodes or anecdotes such as the one that I've written about. In fact, I did visit with the people in the embassy in Addis, and I'm just hopeful that they can be a voice for at a very trench level. I want to throw this out, and that is the journalists who actually operate in Ethiopia today do so at great peril, and I'm most concerned and deeply admire these people who continue to pursue journalism under pretty perilous conditions.
So we're almost out of time, Soliyana, but in the 30 seconds or so we have left, does this incident, being how it has drawn attention to the repression of journalists in Ethiopia, do you think it will lead to any change in terms of the policies of the government?
The government of Ethiopia, I don't think it's really late to expect any change from the Ethiopian government, but maybe it increases the awareness of the international community, and it might also give some signs for the U.S. and for the EU who are supporting the Ethiopian regimes that the things at home are changing significantly, and that can be seen by the actions of Faisa, who has a lot to lose because of doing these things. So I hope that this would create some kind of awareness and also some kinds of a wake-up call for the West.
Soliyana Shimeles is a founding member of Zone 9 Bloggers, which started in Ethiopia. She currently works for Ethiopia Human Rights Project. Fred Desam Lazaro is a correspondent for the PBS NewsHour and executive director of the Undertold Stories Project. That's it for the show today, but there's also more online. If you missed the chance to virtually tag along on our trip to Ethiopia in 2014, catch up on the coverage that came out of it by visiting kojoshow.org/Ethiopia. There you'll hear our original conversation with Soli and two of her fellow Zone 9 bloggers, along with discussions of food aid, infrastructure, and the diplomatic ties between the U.S. and Ethiopia. Remember, too, that you can catch up on recent broadcasts of the show by subscribing subscribing via your favorite podcast app. However you listen, be sure to meet us back here tomorrow at noon for the Politics Hour. We'll speak with Prince George's County Board of Ed Chair about why the district lost its federal Head Start money. We'll also discuss a lawsuit filed by a group of D.C. residents aiming to block a homeless shelter in their neighborhood. And a Republican activist in Montgomery County successfully petitioned to get